They say the Ottoman Empire was a realm of splendor. Domed palaces gleaming under the sun. Sultans cloaked in brocade and power. Golden calligraphy, silken shadows. And the famed imperial harem whispered about with lust and awe. But that's just the surface. When people imagine Ottoman harems, they think of exotic women lounging in silk, perfumed and pampered. But what they never picture are the boys. The mutilated boys. The stolen boys. The ones who didn't get to grow into men because empire carved manhood out of them before it ever began. You see, beneath the grandeur of Topkapi Palace, horror wasn't hidden. It was normal. Some of these boys never spoke again after what was done to them. Some bled out before they reached the gates, and some survived long enough to become the quiet hands behind imperial power, groomed, broken, and rebuilt into tools. Because for the Ottoman Empire's male concubines, what sounds unthinkable today was daily life. Let's begin. When nature cuts deep, the making of a eunuch. To understand their world, you have to understand their wound. Eunuchs weren't born, they were made, and in the Ottoman Empire, this meant taking boys often no older than 8 or 9 from conquered lands, or bought from slave markets. Many were African, some were Balkan, all were voiceless. They were stripped, restrained, and held down, and then came the knife. Castration wasn't partial, it was total. The penis, the scrotum, everything. Gone. Amputated. Crude surgeons used sharpened glass or blades dulled by blood and heat. Anesthetics? None. Prayers? Maybe, but silence was expected. And then came the sand. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but after the mutilation, these boys were buried waist deep in burning hot sand. It wasn't symbolic, it was practical. The heat was meant to cauterize the wound, stop the bleeding, seal the hole, but it didn't always work. In fact, it rarely did. The death rate soared past 80%. Some boys screamed until their lungs collapsed. Others passed out and never woke up. Just a few survived. But the ones who did were never boys again. Property of the Sultan. Those who lived were sent to Istanbul, but they weren't healed. They were reshaped. They were dressed in fine robes they could barely walk in because their groins throbbed with phantom pain. They were renamed, rebranded, and absorbed into the palace as eunuchs. Their future wasn't freedom, it was servitude. Some guarded the harem, others cleaned royal latrines. The most promising were trained to serve the Sultan personally, silent, obedient, watchful. But here's the truly horrifying part. These eunuchs were considered pure not because of their minds or morals, but because their bodies were now useless. No threat of lust, no heirs to plot for, no wife, no seed, no legacy, just silence. And for that, they were trusted. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but even the slightest breach of etiquette, a glance held too long, a word spoken to a concubine, a misstep in ritual could mean death, and not just death erasure. The Sultan didn't have to justify your disappearance. If you failed, you vanished. Picture this, a eunuch, once favored, found guilty of overhearing a conversation he shouldn't. A silk cord wrapped around his throat tightened silently as protocol demanded. No blood, no sound, just the soft shuffle of slippers walking away. Gelded and groomed. But not all eunuchs were disposable. A rare few those who adapted, who learned, who flinched at the right moments and bowed low enough rose through the ranks. They became trusted advisors, royal agents, masters of ceremony, but their path to power was paved with pain. They were taught to dance in silence, pour wine without tremor, read erotic poetry to their masters while knowing they'd never feel its promise. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but eunuchs were required to memorize entire genealogies, political networks, and bedroom protocols. Their minds were honed as sharply as their bodies were dulled. They became the Sultan's eyes, but never his equal. Imagine a boy, barely healed, reciting the names of every concubine in the harem, her likes, her cycles, her rivalries. He does this while kneeling on broken tile. His tongue has learned 10 languages, but his body still bleeds sometimes when he walks too fast. And this was considered a success story. The harem's darkest secret. You think the harem was all women? Think again. Behind the silks and incense, hidden among the whispers and jealousies, were male concubines, silent figures, trained not just in obedience, but in pleasure. While the public face of the harem was feminine, the hidden reality included boys selected for their beauty, their softness, and most of all, their silence. The Ottoman court was a realm where sexuality and power intermingled behind locked doors. Sultans had absolute authority not just over their empire, but over bodies, and sometimes the bodies they chose were not women's. Here's the truly horrifying part. Some of the same boys who were mutilated and trained for obedience were later groomed for companionship. A select few, those whose beauty and pliability stood out, were brought into the Sultan's private quarters, not as servants, as favorites. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Ottoman records occasionally reference Kochek young male dancers trained to entertain and seduce. Though not always eunuchs, many shared similar fates. Dressed in gauzy garments, they performed in the same style as female entertainers, hips swaying, eyes lowered, bells at the ankle. Their function: to entertain, to flatter, and sometimes to serve. Sexual access was never discussed openly, but power didn't need words. Imagine a candlelit hall, heavy with rose oil. The Sultan reclines. A boy dances in silence, knowing that each step might bring favor or ruin, knowing his worth exists only as long as he's wanted, and when he's not, he's sent away, or worse, forgotten. Execution by fountain. For the male concubines and eunuchs who fell from favor, mercy was a foreign concept. The Ottoman court prized discretion over drama. That meant executions were quiet, contained, and final. When a eunuch angered the Sultan or became inconvenient, he wouldn't be put on public trial. He wouldn't be paraded or punished. He'd be summoned and disappear. Strangulation was the preferred method. Silk cords were used not for elegance, but silence. The process was ritualized. No blood, no cries, no spectacle, just hands behind the curtain, a twist, a pull, an ending. But that's not all. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but some eunuchs were drowned in palace fountains. Their bodies slipped beneath the surface, never to be found. Others were tossed into the cisterns beneath Topkapi, vast underground caverns where their bones still may lie, unnamed and forgotten. And some were buried alive as punishment for disloyalty, wrapped in linens, placed in narrow earthen pits, the soil packed gently over their chests. Imagine that. You once touched the Sultan's robes, now you're buried in silence with no tomb, no prayer, no name. Just dirt pressing against your ribs as the empire you helped serve forgets you ever existed. The eunuch who became a god. But among the horror, there was one path to power, thin, treacherous, and soaked in blood. The Kisler Asa, or Chief Black Eunuch, was the highest-ranking eunuch in the Ottoman Empire. He oversaw the imperial harem, commanded thousands of slaves, and whispered directly into the Sultan's ear. His signature could move armies. His orders ended dynasties. But even he was broken first. The men who reached this post were once mutilated boys. They rose through submission, through survival, through becoming more ghost than man, and yet they stood at the heart of an empire. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the chief eunuch controlled royal marriages, access to the Sultan, and even succession. He could manipulate princes, exile viziers, and orchestrate assassinations. He was power incarnate, yet he bore the scars of every cut, every silence, every humiliation it took to get there. Imagine a man seated in a throne of gold, robes dripping with emeralds, giving orders that shake continents, and knowing that behind his jeweled belt is a mutilation that never stopped bleeding. Power in the Ottoman world came at a price, and no one paid more than the ones who could never leave an heir. They called it purity. To justify the system, the empire wrapped it in words like purity, devotion, and order. Eunuchs were said to be above temptation. They were believed to serve with cleaner hearts because they had no lust, no families, no ambition beyond the palace walls. But that was a lie wrapped in velvet. What they really had was nothing to lose. That made them perfect weapons, disposable instruments. Their bodies were no longer theirs. Their voices weren't either. Even their names were taken, replaced with titles, numbers, ranks. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but many eunuchs weren't even allowed to look at themselves in mirrors. It was thought to encourage vanity, dangerous in a creature molded solely for service. Imagine living your life without your reflection, not because there was no mirror, but because you weren't allowed to remember your face. And if you broke that rule, that mirror could be used against you. Shards slipped beneath your skin, hidden lessons left under the surface. Now think about that. In a palace filled with beauty gold tiles, painted ceilings, flowing fountains, there were men forbidden from ever seeing themselves, because to look was to remember, and remembering was dangerous. An empire built on silence. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire's success was shaped in silence. The eunuchs kept secrets no one else could. They knew who visited the Sultan's chambers, who bled in childbirth, who poisoned the dates, who bribed whom, and who whispered which names at midnight. And they never spoke, because to speak was to vanish. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but many historians today believe that the eunuchs helped orchestrate coups, deflect invasions, and even decide the fate of empires, yet they left behind almost no records of their own. Why? Because they weren't allowed to write histories. Their lives were considered extensions of the Sultan's will. No journals, no portraits, no tombstones, just shadows. But their fingerprints are everywhere. On royal births, on assassinations, on sudden changes in law, in favor, in fate. They were the scalpel in the empire's hand, silent, sharp, and discarded when dull. The final image. So now picture this. A man draped in silk, his eyes sunken, his voice a whisper. He walks the marble halls of Topkapi, nodding to guards, glancing at concubines who never look back. He smells of rosewater and old blood. He holds the Sultan's trust in one hand and his own past in the other. He was taken as a child, mutilated in a pit, trained like an animal, elevated like a god. And yet, as he passes the reflecting pool, he looks down and sees nothing. No legacy, no heir, no future. Just ripples. The hidden cost of power. History remembers the sultans, their wars, their wealth, their palaces, but it forgets the bodies that stood on the boys carved into tools, the men who served without a name, the silence that made the empire run. Eunuchs weren't just servants, they were the foundation, and they were broken to build it. So ask yourself, was this the price of civilization, or the symptom of something far more monstrous? Subscribe if you want more of these forbidden history's truths that were buried under dynasties, rewritten by victors, and whispered only in the cracks of empires. Next time we'll enter the court of ancient China where empresses chose their lovers from a pool of eunuchs and one of them killed the emperor with a hairpin.